25 days, not 10, not 15, 25 days. That is the number that defines where this investigation stands right now and why. What has emerged in the last 72 hours fundamentally changes what we thought we understood about what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she disappeared. 25 days since a masked, armed, methodically equipped figure approached the front porch of a house in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona. 25 days since that figure spent documented time inside that residence and left with an 84-year-old woman who has not been seen since. 25 days since the first responders arrived and found a scene that told a story the initial missing person report could not contain. A back door wide open. A front camera knocked from its mount, and blood outside on the porch. And now, for the first time, a law enforcement source is confirming what was found inside. The pattern of blood droplets recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home matches the pattern documented outside. Same vertical fall, same absence of smearing, same absence of drag, same absence of struggle indicators. That detail has not been publicly confirmed until now. And when you understand what blood pattern analysis actually tells investigators, not what movies suggest it means, but what forensic science documents across thousands of cases that match between interior and exterior changes the reconstruction of events in a way that the investigation cannot ignore. At the same time, the DNA evidence that investigators have been counting on to identify whoever walked through that front door is facing a complication. That the sheriff himself acknowledged in a national television interview while his own office issued a public statement on the same day saying there were no updates. That is not a small inconsistency. That is a direct contradiction between what a senior official says to a national audience and what his office tells the general public. And in a case where a family is waiting for answers and an 84-year-old woman is still missing, that gap matters. Before we get into all of it, the blood evidence, the DNA complications, what one of the country's leading forensic genetic genealogy experts says about where this investigation goes from here, and the serious questions being raised about how this case is actually being run, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. We follow the evidence here. We examine the expert analysis. We ask the questions about whether the decisions being made are actually serving the goal of finding Nancy Guthrie. New updates and in-depth coverage every week. If this case matters to you, hit that like button. It helps this reach people who are following this seriously. And drop a comment below. Based on everything you know about this case right now, what do you believe is the single most important piece of evidence investigators are working with? I want to hear your analysis. Now, let's follow the evidence. Before we can explain why what a law enforcement source has just confirmed matters, we need to establish exactly what was already known and what had been unclear about the physical evidence at Nancy Guthrie's home. Nancy Ellen Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She was 84 years old. She had lived in the Tucson area for more than 5 decades, having moved there with her family in the early 1970s. She was widowed in 1988 when her husband Charles died during a mining exploration trip in Mexico. She raised 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. By every account from people who knew her, she was mentally sharp, fiercely independent, deeply rooted in her faith community, and entirely undeserving of what happened to her. Her daughter Savannah, the co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, has been on camera repeatedly since February 1st. Her voice breaking, her words direct, pleading for her mother's return. It is day 24 since our mom was taken in the dark of night from her bed, Savannah said in a video posted to Instagram on February 24th. Every hour and minute and second, she said, has been agony. That is who this investigation is about. Not a case number, not a file, a woman whose family is waiting, and a case whose evidence deserves to be examined with the seriousness it requires. Now, the scene. Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive on the evening of Saturday, January 31st, when her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni dropped her off at her home at approximately 9:50 in the evening. She did not appear the following morning for a scheduled live stream of a church service she regularly attended. A member of her congregation contacted the family. Relatives went to the house around 11 in the morning, searched the property, found no sign of her. At noon on February 1st, the family called 911. When deputies responded, they found something immediately inconsistent with a simple missing person scenario. Nancy Guthrie's phone was inside the home. Her wallet was inside the home. Her vehicle was in the driveway. Her daily medications her doctors have since confirmed she needs to survive, including heart medication she cannot go without for more than 24 hours without serious risk, were still inside the house. The back door to the residence was wide open, and the Nest doorbell camera mounted at the front of the property had been displaced from its bracket. That is, what was visible immediately. What was not immediately public, what would take days of investigation and reporting to establish, was the blood. In the early reporting on this case, multiple outlets noted the presence of blood droplets outside the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home, trailing away from the entrance and down the gravel path toward the driveway. The Pima County Sheriff's Office did not formally confirm this at the time. The sheriff and his team declined to publicly acknowledge the blood evidence in their initial statements. But forensic analysts and experts who reviewed the available footage and reporting described what was visible in specific terms. Droplets fell vertically, straight down 9 degrees. No smearing. No lateral displacement. No evidence of the kind of scatter pattern that accompanies violent physical struggle at the location where the drops were deposited. That matters. Blood pattern analysis is one of the most document-heavy fields in forensic science for a reason. The shape of a blood stain, its directionality, whether it has been stepped in or smeared or scattered by movement, tells investigators something about the physical state of the person depositing it and what was happening at that moment. A straight vertical drop, falling 90 degrees with no evidence of lateral movement, consistently indicates one thing across the documented literature: controlled movement, not chaos, not violent struggle at that specific location. Controlled movement, that was what was known about the exterior. Now here is what has just been confirmed for the first time. A law enforcement source familiar with the investigation has provided specific new information about the interior of the home. The blood droplets found inside Nancy Guthrie's house, inside the residence, not at the exterior threshold, not on the porch, carry the same pattern as the droplets documented outside. The same vertical fall, the same absence of smearing, the same absence of drag indicators, the same absence of physical struggle evidence in the pattern itself. The specific location within the house where this interior evidence was found has not been provided. Whether it was at the entry, in a hallway, in a bedroom, that detail was not given. What the source is stating clearly and specifically is the pattern match between interior and exterior evidence. Here is why that matters beyond the confirmation itself. In forensic reconstruction, consistency of blood pattern evidence across multiple locations within the same scene provides investigators with information about sequence and state. When the pattern inside a home matches the pattern outside, when both show the same controlled vertical fall with no struggle indicators, it suggests something specific about the timeline. Whatever caused the bleeding occurred before or at the point of entry, and the movement through the home following that entry was controlled. Not chaotic, not consistent, with a violent struggle being sustained from the doorway through the interior. This does not tell investigators who was responsible. It does not identify the suspect. What it does is help establish the sequence and nature of the event. And it contradicts the simplest version of what some early reporting had suggested, that the blood outside represented a violent struggle at the threshold. The interior evidence now available to investigators tells a more specific and more complicated story. This same source is also confirming details that had been reported earlier and have now been corroborated. The back door was open. The Nest camera was definitively displaced, moved, removed, or knocked from its mount. The earlier characterization that it had been damaged is now described more precisely as displacement. The exact method by which the camera was moved remains unconfirmed. But between the blood droplets, the open back door, and the deliberately compromised camera, the scene that first responders encountered on the morning of February 1st was not ambiguous. The response escalated from a welfare check to a federal investigation for documented reasons. Now, investigators have an increasingly detailed reconstruction of the physical scene. The question, and this is where the investigation becomes significantly more complicated, is what the biological evidence recovered from inside. That home can tell them about who left it. And that question is exactly where the problems begin. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nonos gave a taped interview to NBC in which he acknowledged that the laboratory currently processing DNA evidence recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home is encountering a significant challenge. The issue, as the sheriff described it, the laboratory is having difficulty isolating what he characterized as a mixed DNA sample. That framing, mixed sample, is critical, and it requires precise explanation because the implications of a mixed versus a single-source biological sample are substantial, and there is significant public confusion about what each scenario actually means for an investigation like this one. To explain exactly what investigators are facing, we turn to someone with direct professional expertise in this specific field. Cease Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, one of the leading organizations in the United States working at the intersection of DNA science and criminal investigation. Her professional experience spans a significant number of cases resolved through the methodology of investigative genetic genealogy, the same methodology now being discussed in connection with the search for whoever took Nancy Guthrie. Moore has spoken publicly about this case in detail, and her assessment is direct and significant. The core question, what does it mean when a laboratory reports difficulty separating a mixed DNA sample? Here is Moore's analysis. If the mixture involved Nancy Guthrie's DNA combined with that of one unknown individual, which would be the most straightforward scenario and the one investigators would most want to be, working with the separation process known as deconvolution would be relatively manageable because Nancy Guthrie's DNA profile is known and available for reference. Her contribution to a mixture could be mathematically subtracted with a reasonable degree of reliability. What would remain after that subtraction would be the unknown individual's profile, potentially viable for database comparison and genetic genealogy. But the sheriff's reporting of difficulty separating the sample suggests that this more straightforward scenario may not be what investigators are actually facing. Moore's assessment is precise if the laboratory is genuinely struggling with this sample. The more probable explanation is that the mixture involves two or more unknown individuals, none of whom have a known reference profile available for subtraction. When you do not know who any of the contributors are, and particularly when the sample may involve three or more individuals, the process of deconvolution becomes substantially more complex. In some proportional configurations, it does not just become difficult. It becomes effectively impossible with current technology. The critical variable is ratio. If one unknown individual represents 90% of the biological material in a sample and a second contributor is present at only 10%, isolating that minor contributor to a degree sufficient for identification may be beyond what any laboratory, regardless of quality, can currently achieve. On the question of the laboratory itself, DNA Labs International, based in Deerfield Beach, Florida, more is direct. This is a capable and experienced facility. It has produced results in genuinely difficult cases. The criticism Sheriff Nunnos received for selecting this laboratory over others was, in her professional view, unwarranted. The choice was sound. The lab is qualified to run the full forensic pipeline: extraction, STR profile creation for database comparison, and SNP profile generation for investigative genetic genealogy simultaneously, which saves investigative time. The challenge being reported is not a reflection of laboratory competence. It is a reflection of the complexity of what was actually recovered from inside the home. Moore walks through the possibilities for how a mixed biological sample could have been: deposited, blood, saliva, sweat, what is commonly called touch DNA, trace biological material transferred through direct skin contact. Hair would not typically produce a mixed profile. So whatever was recovered involves some form of direct biological transfer from multiple individuals. One scenario that has drawn investigative attention is this: the individual seen in the surveillance footage appeared to have what looked like a bite-style flashlight held in his mouth. If that device was used inside the home and then removed, saliva, a rich source of DNA, would have been deposited on both the device itself and on the gloves used to handle it. A gloved hand carrying saliva from that device, then contacting a surface inside the home, a door handle, a wall, any surface, would deposit that biological material. If that same surface had previously been touched by other people, the result could be a mixture with multiple contributors, none of whom are immediately identifiable. That is one possible pathway to the complexity the laboratory is encountering. It is a working hypothesis. It is not a confirmed explanation. But here is what Moore's assessment makes clear. If the mixed sample cannot be successfully separated, if the ratio of contributors is too unfavorable, if the complexity is too high, that particular avenue for identification is closed. The investigation would then need to rely entirely on the other tracks running simultaneously: the purchase trail, the genetic genealogy work from the glove sample, the range rover forensics, the tip line intelligence. Each of those tracks matters more if the interior DNA sample proves unworkable. As of this reporting, the status of that interior sample remains unresolved. Now, let's talk about the glove sample, because that is where the first confirmed DNA result in this case already produced a result, and that result has implications that are not being fully explained in most coverage. Approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators found a glove, black, appearing to match the type worn by the masked figure in the doorbell camera footage. DNA recovered from that glove was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains profiles from over 26 million individuals, convicted offenders, forensic samples from unsolved cases, and missing persons. The result came back negative. No match. Not a single hit across 26 million profiles. That result is significant in a specific and precise way. It does not mean the investigation hit a wall. What it means is this: whoever left biological material on that glove does not have a qualifying criminal conviction in the system. They have not previously been required to submit a DNA sample to any federal or state law enforcement database. That is information. It is not the information investigators were hoping for, but it narrows the profile of who this person is in a documentable way. Because of that negative CODIS result, investigators have been pursuing a different avenue, investigative genetic genealogy. This method works differently from standard DNA database matching. Rather than looking for a direct profile match, it uses a different type of genetic marker, ASNP profile, to search voluntary consumer DNA databases. The underlying principle is that distant relatives share small but measurable segments of inherited DNA, second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. By finding those partial matches in the accessible databases and building family trees outward from those matches, investigators can work backward to identify a living individual whose DNA matches the original crime scene profile. This is the methodology that identified Brian Koberger in the Idaho student murders. It does not require a prior criminal record. It requires one thing: a biological relative who has voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to an accessible database. But here is what most public coverage gets wrong about this, and Moore is direct on this point. The consumer databases currently accessible to law enforcement for this purpose are GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and the newer nonprofit database DNA Justice. The three platforms most people associate with consumer DNA testing: Ancestry DNA, Transfers 3-and-me, and Muheritage have closed their databases to law enforcement access. The profiles in those systems cannot currently be searched in connection with criminal investigations. The widespread public belief that law enforcement already has access to Ancestry and 23andMe is factually incorrect. Those companies have taken an explicit position against law enforcement access, and the legal mechanisms that could change that have not yet been tested in the way that would be required to compel it. What this means practically, if the suspect in Nancy Guthrie's case has no relatives in GED Match, Family Tree DNA, or DNA Justice if his family has only used Ancestry or 23andMe, investigative genetic genealogy cannot currently reach him through those databases. That is a real limitation. It is not a reason to conclude the investigation is blocked. It is a reason to understand precisely where the constraints are. But the DNA complications are not the most troubling part of what has emerged in the last several days. The most troubling part is the communication pattern. On the same day that Sheriff Chris Nonos gave a taped interview to NBC in which he acknowledged that the Florida laboratory was having difficulty separating the mixed DNA sample, acknowledging a specific, significant, and consequential development in the investigation, his office released a written public statement. That statement read, "In relevant part, all evidence from the crime scene and search warrant scenes has been submitted for analysis. Lab experts are working through that analysis, and as with any biological evidence, there can be challenges separating DNA." And then this line, "There are currently no updates regarding this process. There are currently no updates." On the same day, the sheriff gave a national television interview describing a specific and significant update about the difficulty the laboratory is encountering. This is not a minor inconsistency. This is a direct contradiction between what a senior law enforcement official communicates to a national television audience in a one-on-one interview and what his office provides to the general public through its official written statement. Both communications carry investigative weight. Both are being used by the public, by journalists, by anyone following this case to understand where the investigation actually stands. When those two communications directly contradict each other on a material point, the information environment around this investigation becomes unreliable, and the contradiction about the DNA sample is not the only one. In that same period, Sheriff Nonos stated publicly that there are no names his team is looking into. He said this to NBC at the same time. Independent reporting, including on-camera statements from gun shop employees across Tucson, documented something very different. Federal agents had been visiting gun shops with photographs with names. This R list. Sources familiar with that canvassing described a list of between 40 and 60 individuals whose purchase history of gear, visible in the surveillance footage, had been identified and was being run against gun shop transaction records. Those gun shop employees, said agents, asked them directly, "Have you seen this person? Can you identify this weapon? Can you identify this holster?" The sheriff's statement that there are no names his team is looking into does not square with that documented reality. A distinction can be made. Perhaps those individuals had not yet risen to the level of formal suspects. Perhaps names being checked against purchase records are not the same as names being formally investigated as suspects. Those distinctions are real and they matter legally. But the public-facing implication of there are no names we are looking into, delivered to a national audience while federal agents are simultaneously walking into gun shops with photographs and lists, creates a credibility problem that compounds over time. There are also structural concerns that have now been raised publicly about how this investigation is being run internally. A report citing a source described as an insider familiar with the investigation alleged that Sheriff Nonos has been limiting operational decision-making on this case to himself and to senior officers. The source's characterization that experienced detectives who would normally drive an investigation of this complexity are being directed rather than empowered, and that information sharing with the FBI has been constrained, is described as highly unusual for a case of this scale and visibility. The source used a phrase that has been widely quoted: "The tail is wagging the dog." These are unconfirmed allegations from an unnamed source. The sheriff's office has not formally responded to the specific claims. The sheriff has separately stated that several hundred law enforcement personnel remain dedicated to this case and that it will remain active until Nancy Guthrie is found or every lead is exhausted. But here is what can be assessed objectively when a sheriff simultaneously conducts a national television interview disclosing investigative complications and issues a public statement declaring there are no updates on the same subject. The information environment around this investigation becomes harder for everyone to navigate: the public, journalists, potential witnesses, and critically, anyone who might have information and is trying to gauge whether law enforcement is on top of this case before deciding whether to come forward. The sheriff has announced no press briefings are scheduled and no media availability is anticipated. In a case now entering its fourth week with the subject still missing, that communication posture is a choice. And choice now step back. Look at the full pattern of evidence. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera went offline. At 2:12 in the morning, the camera's motion detection system registered a person, but no video was available. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker app showed a disconnection from her phone. Someone was in that house during that window. Someone who had done enough advance work on that property to know which camera to target first. Someone who had, according to a neighbor interviewed this week, potentially been seen in the neighborhood 2 weeks before the abduction. A man who, as the neighbor told Fox News, did not have typical walking gear on and had his hat pulled really far over his eyes. The figure in the doorbell footage is approximately 5'9" to 5'10", average build, carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack, a backpack sold exclusively through Walmart, whose management is currently working with investigators to identify and isolate the specific purchaser. He is wearing a ski mask, dark jacket, dark pants. He has a gun in a holster positioned near the center of his waistband, a position that firearms expert John Correia, speaking to NBC News, described as unusual. Not the positioning of an experienced gun owner, Correia noted. He is wearing gloves. He has what appears to be a bite-style flashlight held in his mouth while he works at covering the camera. He spends 41 documented minutes in or around that house, and then he leaves. With an 84-year-old woman who needs daily heart medication to survive. Multiple ransom-style communications have been sent to media outlets since the disappearance. TMZ received a note days after the disappearance. The note, as reported by outlet founder Harvey Levin, described Nancy Guthrie as okay but scared and contained one detail about her Apple Watch that had not been previously reported, a detail that investigators took seriously as a possible indicator of authentic knowledge. KOLD, the CBS affiliate in Tucson, received what appeared to be the same letter. A second note was later sent to KOLD's tip email. The FBI also received what appeared to be ransom communication via email. Two deadlines contained in the original note, February 5th and February 9th, passed without confirmed contact between any party holding Nancy Guthrie and the family or law enforcement. A California man was arrested in early February for sending a fraudulent ransom demand via text message to the family. The FBI confirmed he was attempting to profit from the case and had no actual connection to the disappearance. His arrest is documented. His case is separate from the communications investigators have taken seriously. The family has been cleared entirely. The sheriff has stated explicitly that to suggest otherwise is not only wrong, it is cruel. The Guthrie family are victims, he said, and that framing is accurate. Savannah Guthrie stepped away from her NBC duties, including planned coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympiade search. On February 24th, she announced a family reward of up to $1 million for the recovery of Nancy Guthrie, payable for recovery, not for information, for bringing her mother home. The family also announced a $500,000 donation to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, because, as Savannah Guthrie said, they know there are millions of families who have suffered with this kind of uncertainty. Investigators have also been pursuing a separate forensic avenue, or Silver. Range Rover was towed from the parking lot of a Culver's restaurant near the intersection of 1st and River on the night of February 13th, following a traffic stop in which at least 4 people were detained for questioning and subsequently released without charges. That vehicle is still in forensic processing. The results of that analysis have not been publicly reported. Multiple additional gloves have been collected from the area surrounding the Guthrie residence beyond the original glove found 2 miles from the home. The sheriff's office has confirmed the collection of multiple gloves, though specific numbers and locations have not been provided. Whether any of those additional gloves have produced viable biological profiles for comparison has not been indicated. Now, look at all of it together. Blood inside the home. Blood outside the home. The same controlled pattern in both locations, with no indicators of violent struggle in the blood evidence itself. A front camera deliberately disabled. A back door left open. All medications left behind. A suspect with no prior DNA record in any national law enforcement database. A mixed biological sample inside the home that may be too complex to separate into an identifiable profile. A purchase trail running through Walmart and gun shops across Tucson. A Range Rover in forensic processing. More than 40,000 tips submitted to law enforcement. A family reward of $1 million now generating what federal officials have described as the largest tip volume of the investigation to date. Every one of those threads is real. Every one of them is being actively worked. And every one of them exists in the context of a communication pattern from the lead agency that has introduced unnecessary confusion into an investigation where clarity serves the goal of finding Nancy Guthrie and confusion does not. The investigation is not stalled. Multiple tracks are running simultaneously. The tip line is receiving actionable information. The forensic work on the Range Rover continues. The genetic genealogy process, dependent on the viability of the DNA profiles, is moving. The purchase trail is narrowing. The sheriff's office has committed that this investigation will remain active until Nancy Guthrie is found, or every lead is exhausted. What investigators need right now, and what the 40,000 plus people who have already called the tip line understand, is that specific, observable information from the Tucson area is what breaks cases like this. Behavioral changes in people that began around February 1st. A change in routine without explanation. Unexplained absences. Nervousness that did not make sense at the time. Any knowledge of someone who matches the physical description from the footage, approximately 5'9" to 5'10". Average build, or who purchased the specific gear visible in those images, the backpack, the holster, the mask, the jacket. If you know something, the number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The combined reward now stands above $1,200,000. Nancy Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942. She spent more than 5 decades building a life in Tucson. She raised 3 children who love her. She has grandchildren. She has a faith community that has been praying for her return since the morning of February 1st. She is 84 years old. She is without her medication, and she deserves for every available resource and every capable investigative mind to be working toward bringing her home. The blood evidence inside the house changes the reconstruction of what happened that night. The DNA complications may limit how quickly biology can identify who was responsible, but the investigation has other tracks. And the question that this evidence, all of it together, demands an answer to is the same one it has demanded since the beginning. Who walked through that front door? Who made those choices? And where is Nancy Guthrie right now? Someone in Tucson knows. Someone has already seen something that, in the context of what they now know about this case, looks different than it did before. If that person is watching this, the number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. If this investigation matters to you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Every time there is something meaningful to report on this case, we will be here. Share this video with anyone who is following this case and wants the evidence examined seriously. And leave your analysis in the comments. Which of the current investigative tracks do you believe is most likely to break this case first? The DNA work? The purchase trail? The Range Rover? The tip line? The evidence is there. The answer is in Tucson. And the search for Nancy Guthrie continues.